Welcome back to RHC Shorts. I hope you had a good cost reporting season. Ours was very busy, but now that it's over, we're looking forward to getting back into making some more informational content. Cost reporting season is actually what brought us our topic for today. We're going to take a look at the Medicare rate cap. This is going to be related to another video that we did on the cost per visit calculation. That would have been RHC Shorts number 2. I encourage you to take a look at that. But this is going to be a fundamentally different discussion. That video talked about how an individual clinic's cost per visit is calculated. Today, we're going to discuss the highest rate that a clinic can get paid based on that calculation. And we're going to discuss how everything kind of works together to inform changes to reimbursement rates year over year. And we're going to talk about clinics operating over the cap and operating under the cap, what those terms mean, and what reimbursement looks like in each situation. It's kind of a dense topic for today, so we'll go ahead and jump in. So before we really get into the rate caps themselves, I want to take a brief moment and talk about how a clinic's rate is determined. So it is the lesser of either the calculated cost per visit or the rate cap for the period. Of course, the cost per visit we talked about in our cost per visit calculation video, RHC Shorts number 2, but generally this is allowable costs divided by RHC visits. One thing that I'll mention is that once people kind of realize that their reimbursement rate is the lesser of these two numbers, um, the first thought is, okay, so how can I keep up with the rate cap in order to keep reimbursement as high as possible? I'll go ahead and say that's not really the mindset to take into this because there's just kind of a fundamental problem with it. This is what we refer to as chasing the cap, because what you have to do is you have to continually try to spend more and more money every year in order to justify as high of a cost per visit as you can get. But the problem with that is that even if Medicare is accepting this rate and paying it, your commercial payers are only going to pay what has already been agreed to. And your cost per visit is calculated based on all visits, not just Medicare visits. Uh, so let's say it's 2028, where the rate cap is $190 a visit. You'd have to spend $190 for every visit you have in order to justify that rate for Medicare. But let's just say if Blue Cross Blue Shield is only paying you $120, then your clinic just lost $70 on every Blue Cross Blue Shield patient seen throughout the whole year. You end up bleeding the clinic dry if your goal is just to spend as much money as possible to chase the Medicare rate, because you have to keep spending money to maintain that rate. You'll end up spending more than you make, and you'll go out of business. So that's what we don't want to do. So we don't want to chase the cap. So then, what is the right way to look at this? In general, we just want to operate efficiently, whatever that means for your clinic. Spend what you need to spend in order to operate, but don't go chasing down expenses and actively looking to spend more money just to get a higher cost per visit, because that's only going to lead you down a bad road. What you do need to be doing is staying aware of your cost per visit and staying aware of what you're actually getting paid from your MAC for your Medicare visits. Uh, and you want to stay aware of these because we want to avoid surprises at cost reporting time. And when I say surprises at cost report time, this is gonna be a common theme throughout this video. I'm talking about generally big reimbursement swings, big changes to your cost per visit that would then be reflected in your payment rate. We want to avoid having big payables at the end of the year that come from a decreased rate, and we want to be wary of any big receivables from an increased rate, because if that increase in the rate isn't sustainable over future periods, you're going to end up having it payable the next year anyway. So we just want to be aware of what is impacting your rate calculation so that we can know how to plan for the future, and so that we don't end up having to pay out large sums of money to the Medicare administrative contractors when cost report time comes around. So this is the actual rate cap schedule that we've been working through the past few years, and we'll be continuing to work through as we get through the end of the 2020s. As one might expect from the name, the rate cap is the highest per visit reimbursement that a clinic can get paid for a Medicare visit during a given period. So for independent RHCs, you've seen this cap go up by a lot over the past few years, and it's going to continue to go up. This has been very good for a lot of clinics. You can see on the table here that the cap at the beginning of 2021 was less than $90 a visit, and it had been stuck in that range for quite some time. It would only be going up by one to not even $2 every year. And then, as you can see here, now the cap is scheduled to increase by $13 every single year until 2028. So basically, what this means is that clinics that have been in the program for a while, who had been operating well over the cap for years, we're going to be operating under the cap in just a few years' time. So, in talking about operating over the cap and operating under the cap, we're going to take a look at what both of those situations look like. The first thing I want to point out and make sure everyone understands it is that this is not a choice that you make. This is just the situation that your clinic is going to find itself in based on comparing the clinic's cost per visit to what the cap currently is. So, operating over the cap is what most clinics for a large amount of the history of the RHC program have been doing. From what we saw, clinics would operate anywhere from $50 to $100 per visit over where they were getting paid by Medicare. So this is where the situation that most clinics found themselves in. And then as we move forward, as the cap gets higher and higher, more and more clinics are going to be finding themselves operating under the cap. So let's start here. So what does it mean to operate over the cap? Operating over the cap means that your calculated cost per visit on your cost report is either at or above the given rate cap for the year. There are some pros and cons to this that I've got outlined here on this slide, and this is how most independent RHCs operated for years before the new legislation passed. The biggest issue is obviously that your Medicare reimbursement doesn't actually keep up with your costs. So if you're spending $170 per visit, let's say, and your MAC is only paying you $139 per visit, which is the 2024 cap, then you're actually losing $31 on every Medicare patient that you saw during the year. Now, there are some upsides to this. They're more administrative in nature, but there are some upsides. So if your costs are above the cap, that does mean that your cost report, at least from a reimbursement and settlement perspective, is going to be very predictable. There's not going to be a big payable or a big rate related receivable. Obviously, if you do flu, pneumococcal, or COVID shots or are submitting bad debts, you might have some receivable money from that. But you're not going to have a big receivable related to your rate. So there's not going to be big reimbursement swings back and forth where you're having to either pay a large sum of money back to Medicare or you're not getting this large sum of money because you've been paid it through the year. So you end up having like I said, a very predictable cost reporting process. Another upside is that if there's small changes in operations that you have, it's not going to impact your reimbursement rate because you're already operating over the cap. So, for example, if you saw a certain number of visits in one year and you had a certain number of costs, and then the next year you saw, let's say, 1,000 more visits, but your costs either stayed relatively the same or only went up by a little bit, not really in line with how much your visits increased, then your actual calculated cost per visit is going to go down. But if you're operating well over the cap, then it may not go down enough to actually impact what you're getting paid by Medicare. And so you're not going to see this large payable that you're having to pay back. So it's not actually going to impact your reimbursement rate, and you're not going to have to deal with that shift. Um, so, like I said, because there's no impact from these small changes in operations, um, you're not going to see these big reimbursement swings year over year. So that's what operating over the cap looks like. What's happening as these rate caps continue to increase is we have more and more and more clinics that are now operating under the cap. So basically, everything that we just said gets flipped on its head. The good news here, obviously, is that once you cross this threshold into operating under the cap, Medicare reimbursement is keeping up with your costs. You're not losing money on seeing Medicare patients. Everything else, though, does get a little bit more complicated because now every little change can and will impact your reimbursement rate. So that example I mentioned earlier of having increased visit volume without matching increased costs, suddenly that rate calculation moving your rate down, that's going to tank your cost per visit, which is then going to impact what you're actually getting reimbursed from Medicare. And then worse than that, when your rate falls out, that's going to trigger a probably large payable to Medicare when you actually file your report. So that's why it's super, super, super important to be aware of your costs, be aware of your visits, and then be aware of how individual items are impacting your cost report. This is one reason why we're trying to go through and talk about all these different things that impact your report and put out these informational videos is so that you can be aware of a lot of these things and that you can be on the lookout for these kinds of changes so that if you're experiencing something like this, it doesn't have to become a big, huge surprise and a difficult situation when we are under the gun and trying to get a cost report submitted in late May. So it's very important to keep an eye out on your costs and on your visits in order to avoid a bad situation like that. So what does all of this mean? We've kind of talked about what the Medicare rate caps are, what it means to be over the cap versus what it means to be under the cap. But what are the takeaways from this? So overall, despite some of the scary things associated with it, increased rate caps are a very good thing for RHCs. When it's all said and done, it still means that Medicare is paying you up to your cost. This is a much, much better situation than we had when clinics were spending $50 or $100 more per visit than Medicare was paying them. You know, you're not losing money on Medicare patients, and that's the big takeaway. But as I talked about a second ago, it's more important than ever to understand what is actually impacting your cost report and then how those factors might change on a year over year basis. You want to be aware of what you're getting paid and then how that compares to your cost per visit. Um, it's calculated on your report. It's important to understand that sometimes the max might pay the rate cap even if you're operating under it. Um, so you want to be on the lookout for that. Because if at the end of the year you were getting paid higher than what your calculated cost per visit was, you're going to owe a payable back to the MAC for the difference. That's how the cost report works. It is a system to make sure that your payments are in line with your costs. So if you're noticing that that's not the case, that you're getting paid higher than what your costs actually are, then that's going to show up on your cost report and there's going to be a payable associated with it. There are ways to get ahead of that though. If you're getting paid more than your cost, reach out to your consultant, um, ask them about an interim cost report. That's one thing that we can do that can help us get ahead of the game and not be too surprised when the actual annual cost report comes due. We can put something together, kind of check in on where you're at for the year as far as your cost per visit versus what your payment rate is, and then we can submit that to the MAC to start getting your rate corrected and even getting some true up settlements done ahead of time so that it's not as big and not as surprising when the cost report comes. One last thing that I want to talk about here is that as these rate caps keep getting higher and as we have smaller and smaller items making bigger and bigger impacts on um, reimbursement rates, RHC cost reports are going to have a higher audit risk. Historically, Medicare wasn't paying out as much money to RHCs based on their rates, so there wasn't much any reason for CMS or the MACs to actually look or verify the rate calculation information on the cost report. But that's not how it is anymore. Because the caps are going up and because more clinics are operating under the cap, every piece of information matters and the MACs are going to start double checking us. So in order to prepare for this, we just need to make sure that our documentation is as clean and clear as possible, and that we have all the documentation to support what's going in the cost reports. As always, if you're looking for RHC information, these are two great resources to look at. If you're not a member of the RHC Information Exchange Facebook group, highly recommend it. There are so many knowledgeable people on there who have lots of years of experience with rural health clinics who can help guide you and help answer your questions. And then, of course, our website, ruralhealthclinic.com, we try to keep you up to date on everything there as well. If you haven't watched any of the other episodes in our RHC short series, I highly recommend that. Check out some of our other videos. We have a playlist on cost reporting information. And of course, if you have any recommendations or suggestions for topics to cover in a video like this, leave a comment, reach out to us, let us know what you want to see. So, thank you and have a great day. If you haven't watched any of the other videos that we put out in our RHC short